Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our session today on active attacks in healthcare, where we're going to talk about examples of attacks, protections to avoid those attacks, and lessons learned from our experiences. Joining me today is Asher Brass. Asher, give a big wave. Asher is head of our cyber network analysis team and our broader Scenario Live team. Does a lot of the research we'll see here today, as well as others like Jekyllbot 5, where Asher and team identified issues in hospital robots, which we won't talk about today, but I can pass that information along for anyone that wants it. My name is Chad Holmes. I'll be running the session today. I'm a security evangelist for Scenario, which means I get to work with smart researchers like Asher and present the information they do, not just for our customers, but for the world of healthcare to make sure that we're protecting our patients and our facilities. A little bit about Scenario before we start. Scenario was founded about 6 years ago with a pretty simple goal. We want to secure every IoT, OT, and medical device in healthcare environments. We spent the first couple of years of our existence building out a core technology, decided to raise a round of funding, start going to market with it, and we're quickly recognized as both a Gartner Cool vendor and a Forrester Wave leader. As we've built up customers, we've also been working with KLAS to do research around that, and our customers have given us a 96.1 overall KLAS score, which we're incredibly thankful for. So many thanks to everyone out there, and hopefully we have more future customers on this call that will also give us equally glowing reviews in the future. So jumping right into things today, I'm going to start a little bit with an overview of the impact of cyber attacks on healthcare. And the reason I like to do this is quite frequently when we talk to customers and prospects, they know about one or two attacks. They have a general feeling that healthcare is a target of cyber attacks, but they don't quite realize how widespread that is. So I'm going to give you some stats and some data you can use when you're having those discussions. Then we'll shift to attack trends, talk about the types of attacks that we're seeing. From there, we're going to go really, really deep, and I'm going to hand over to Asher, where he talks about attack specifics, stopping the attacks in their tracks, and what we can do to prevent those. As always, please ask questions as we go through. We'll try to answer them in real time. If we can't, we'll get to them at the end. So don't be bashful. Just use that little question box over on the side of the BrightTalk screen. So let's start by talking about the impact of those attacks. From left to right here are some stats that we've done both through our research studies and pulled from others as well. The first one, I believe this is a proof point study that was recently published, where almost 90% of hospitals have experienced at least one cyber attack in the last 12 months. The reality is the other 11% probably have as well, and they just don't realize it yet. So we are seeing widespread cyber attacks, very focused on healthcare. We do know that there is a impact on patients during these attacks. It's not a direct impact, right? We're not seeing hackers go in and turn off IV pumps or turn on CT machines, but we do know that within healthcare, anytime there is an impact to care, whether it's hurricane, power outage, cyber attack, et cetera, there's a high likelihood of an adverse impact to patient. We did a survey last year with the Pony1 organization. They said that 45% of hospitals report adverse patient impacts. So there is a significant amount of collateral damage when a cyber attack occurs. We're also seeing that nearly the same amount, 43% of hospitals have suffered at least one ransomware attack. I strongly believe that next time we do the survey, that's going to be well over 50%. And one of the reasons we're seeing those ransomware attacks is because half of the time, 47% of the time, hospitals pay. And the reasons hospitals pay is because the ransoms are often a reasonable amount of money, so a couple $100,000, maybe $1 million, and it gets them online really quickly. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't pay. That's an incredibly difficult conversation to have, one we all hope we never have to have. But the reality is, as long as payments keep happening, ransomware attacks will happen as well. The good news is that there are industry standard protections that we can pull from other industries to help protect against these types of attack. One that our team focuses on in particular is something called network segmentation or microsegmentation, effectively minimizing the communication between devices. So only a device that needs to talk to another one can talk. There is no unnecessary cross chatter. And what happens when you do that, it stops the spread of attacks. So maybe one device or two devices get taken out, not hundreds or thousands. And what we found is that something like a common practice like microsegmentation will address up to 92% of critical risks in a healthcare environment. So while we're in a really rough spot in healthcare, while there's a lot of attacks happening, there are known best practices that we can pull from other industries that we're hoping can help healthcare. I also like to talk a little bit about EPHI and how well we're protecting patient data whenever we talk about these stats. Because the reality is, for about 15 years, the healthcare industry has been focused in terms of cybersecurity on protecting patient data. That's been the number one priority when it comes to cybersecurity. And it's always good to look and say, are we doing a good job there? So if you look at last year's data breach stats from the HHS wall of shame, as it's often called, we found that about 85% of all the breaches there, all the records exposed, were due to some kind of hacking or IT incident. That was about 43 million patient records. That's roughly 15% of the entire US population. These are US stats, by the way. We also found that there were 550 data breaches due to a hacking or IT incident. About 80% of all the breaches we saw there. Others were because of lost data or someone had physical access. But by far, the majority of data breaches at this point are because of some kind of hacking or IT incident. There is good news. I don't get to present good news a lot, so I like to whenever I can. The good news is that between 2021 and 2022, there was minimal year-over-year change. These numbers were nearly identical, and it may have even dropped like a tiny 0.5%. The problem is, if we look at a bigger frame of reference, 5 years, for example, the number of hacking and IT events has increased by 270%, and they've become incredibly efficient in stealing patient records. The number of records stolen in the last 5 years has increased 1,300%. So at the end of the day, even the basic focus of our cybersecurity practices in healthcare, which is to protect patient data, we're starting to see that modern attacks are beating out the traditional systems that we've adopted. If anyone wants to see the deeper data there, they can always go to the HHS wall of shame. Again, feel free to ask questions how we got this, but pretty simple calculations there based on year over year. So now that we've talked about the problem, let's talk a little bit about how attackers are getting in. We see the outcome, we see the data breaches, we see the ransomware attacks, but why are they happening? And Asher, if you want to talk a little bit about why devices in particular are under so much stress, I think it'd be really helpful in setting the stage.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. So one of the ways that we like to model sort of the different kinds of risks and what which one of these risks is most worrying or needs to attract the most attention is sort of as an iceberg, right? The device level risks, a certain model of a certain, let's say, MRI device made by a manufacturer has a overflow vulnerability, right? Someone found some way to shut it down remotely. Some sort of risk that is associated with a specific kind of device that does a specific function in the hospital, right? These are often pretty high profile. They're often quite severe, right? The impact is quite substantial. They shut down the device, or they can lead to a remote takeover of the device, or things like that. But in practice, these sort of vulnerabilities are quite rarely utilized, or maybe even close to never utilized by attackers when they're actually attacking a hospital or another healthcare organization. Attackers generally prefer utilizing vulnerabilities that are much more generic, that require a lot less of them, that don't require them, for instance, to study a specific kind of CT device and how the proprietary medical protocol there works, and then look up some other security firm's research and realize how to implement that. That's a lot of work for a hacker, right? Most of what we see actually happening in healthcare environments and actually putting patient safety and confidentiality, et cetera, at risk is below the waterline, right? Is not easily noticed just by looking at the device and just by knowing what version of software it's running, for instance. So most prominent one probably is operating system risks, right? Typically we mean outdated Windows devices, although there are other operating machines that have their own antiquated versions with risks. If you look at something like the WannaCry Eternal Blue events of 2017, those are all older Windows devices. There are a lot of older Windows devices in hospitals that are still susceptible to those kinds of attacks, or actually to that exact same attack that a lot of different organizations were affected by in 2017. the challenge here is partially a detection challenge, right? It's not always so straightforward to know what kind of operating system a specific radiological device or an IV pump is running. But primarily the challenge here is actually, what do I do about it, right? Because a lot of times these operating systems are not easily upgradable. There's either a service contract with the manufacturer, or there are all kinds of other complications. It's not an easy thing to just upgrade the Windows version, right? If we go to SBOM, right, software bill of material risks, great recent example is the Log4Shell vulnerability that I'm sure most of you have probably heard of. It's much more difficult to know whether a specific device has implemented a specific version of a specific library that is vulnerable to a cyber attack. That's much more difficult to detect than, for example, an OS or of course a device level risk. But we have seen that these sort of risks are used, or these sort of vulnerabilities are used quite often in real world attacks on hospital devices. The last category is maybe a little bit less well defined, as more of a catch-all, but we've taken to calling this configuration risks, right? If we're looking at a CT device, it could have an outdated operating system. It could have a specific kind of log4j that is still susceptible to log4shell vulnerability. It could have a device level risk. But ultimately, if it has a web page that is open with no authentication, and an attacker can just access that web page and control the CT device, that's what the attacker is going to do, right? It's the path of least resistance. It's the easiest. It's also surprisingly tricky to detect if you're a hospital and you're interested in closing this open web page, for example. We go into a couple of other examples of how this can affect where this sort of manifests in the real world later, I think.
Cool. And we've got a question that just came in, so I'll ask it. It's one of my favorite ones, so I'm glad to whoever asked it. Thank you. Which is, can you give us an example of a complex machine? And I think, or the complex stack. I'll rephrase that. And I think IV pumps are always the perfect example here. An infusion pump or an IV pump is intended to deliver medicine in some consistent way. But if you look at the components of that device, it's everywhere from the outer plastic shell and the buttons you're pushing to the silicone chips that are actually processing that data in probably 10 to 15 layers of components that came from different manufacturers in between. So whenever we're looking at something like that, it's not an IV pump. It's an incredibly complex piece of machinery that has a lot of different libraries, a lot of different components that are incredibly vulnerable. Anything to add to that, Asher?
No, that's great.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's IV pumps are the perfect example, and we have all kinds of studies around that we can pass along. So good question. So Asher, what I'm going to have you talk about in a little bit is the actual types of attacks we're seeing. And we're going to go from ransomware, which is by far the one we're all terrified of, where someone will come in, encrypt your system and say, give us X number of dollars and we'll restore it. You'll talk a little bit about remote access Trojans, where people can watch screens, legacy worms. You talked about WannaCry just a second ago. We recently released a report for the UK specifically, which was hit by WannaCry, where about 2% of their devices still have the vulnerabilities that would make them susceptible to an attack. We'll talk about the reality of attackers on healthcare, which is they are relatively unevolved and they take spray and pray approaches. And then we'll hit back on the original point I made earlier, which is we're doing this mostly under the name of protecting EPHI, some for preventing ransomware. We're going to take a look at some recent studies that you've been working on around how well we're actually preventing EPHI. Before we do that, and I apologize because Asher's face isn't on this as well, it should be, we did do a session around the details of each of those attacks without the specific examples we're going to show in a second. So if you do want to learn more about the attacks more academically, there's a good link for you where you can always go watch it on the Webinar Wednesday Tech Nation YouTube channel. This one, though, let's go ahead and jump right into the specific attacks. And as we do that, I want everyone to keep in mind that we have a fairly complex combination of humans and technology that we're doing this for. So first of all, Asher's team, as well as our technology, is 100% healthcare focused. We don't focus on oil and gas and other industries. It allows us to understand the context of what we're seeing. We analyze data using something called passive analysis, so we don't interfere with network traffic, and then do deep packet inspection in an automated way with the technology. We pull out a subset of metadata, analyze that in the cloud using deeper AI detection and analysis. Once we have potential findings there, we then hand it over to the Scenario Live team, Asher's team, for human validation and action. So all the hospitals out there that have a lot of tools that are getting a lot of noise, we bring the people that cut through that noise to make sure that you can actually focus on the attacks that are happening, preventing those, not going through the bits and bytes over and over and over, looking for the needle in the haystack. And that allows us effectively to implement same-day security instead of getting you in the newspapers for months. You'll see as Asher goes through, a lot of the attacks we identify and stop are measured in hours, not kind of building up over months, then executing, and then you're recovering for months and spending lots of money. Asher, anything you wanted to add to my very brief introduction of the complex work you do? No. Cool. Let's jump right in there. I'm going to hand it over to you. Let's start with you smelling a rat.
Absolutely. So I'll just mention these are all real-world examples. Obviously, we're not mentioning the hospitals or any other details, identifiable information, but these are all real examples that happened and we've dealt with over the last probably 6 months, maybe even a little less than that. So Chad mentioned rats, remote access Trojans. I think when most people, when the layman thinks of a virus or a cyber virus, that this is what they think of, right? They think of an individual machine that is infected, typically from insecure internet surfing or phishing or any sort of scam like that, and it's just an individual device that is affected. In this case, we were looking at basically we noticed a Windows workstation in our hospital that was not directly, immediately involved in clinical activities, but had access to various information systems that contained patient information and had to do with clinical functioning. And we noticed that it was doing two things that were quite strange. The first is it was calling out to the internet to IPs that we, with various indicators of compromise and also with some AI and machine learning capabilities that we have, we flagged these external addresses as suspicious. Upon closer examination, we also noticed that it had some strange internal traffic as well. It wasn't behaving as we would expect a Windows workstation in this standing to be behaving. We're not entirely sure what was the root cause of the infection. It probably happened before we had been installed. As I said, most likely these things are typically phishing or insecure internet surfing. In any case, we noticed that this machine came online, started behaving oddly, started talking to external addresses that were strange. We got on the case, and within probably a few minutes, we noticed that this was actually a rat that we were familiar with, that we'd seen before, called Sectop rat. Sorry. And the primary function of this virus basically is to stream your desktop or the infected device's desktop back to the attacker. So within a few minutes, we were able to identify that this external communication that had seemed suspicious to us was in fact malicious. We identified both a control plane, which is basically all kinds of metadata, static information that the attacker was pulling from the device, right? All kinds of log files and other files that were saved on the system and so on. But we also actually managed to identify the streaming, the live streaming, if you will, of the affected device's desktop to the attacker. Now, if this was my personal device, that would be one thing, but this is a device that is quite routinely looking at patient files, looking at cases, looking at imagery, looking at billing information for patients, looking at all kinds of very sensitive, very protected information and health information. So this is obviously very worrying. We notified the customer within the hour. Oh, we have the minutes here. We notified the customer after 34 minutes. After about 25 minutes, the customer took the machine off the network. We suggested that they scan it. They immediately scanned it, and forensics showed that it was indeed Sectop rat. And they cleaned it. They put it back on the network. Everything was fine. We don't believe that because of the hours of activity of the virus, no actual patient data or employee data was put at risk. No one was really using the computer when this happened. But you can quite easily imagine that if it was during the workday and someone was on this desktop, they would have had access to all sorts of information. Chad, anything you want to add about this case?
No, we did have one question that came in, which was how many records were exposed, how many could have been exposed. You answered that. No records were exposed in this case. Was the customer able to confirm that through the logs, or how did they confirm no exposure?
Basically, they just confirmed that no one was using that device in the hours that we noticed the activity.
Great.
Yeah.
And then one other, why wasn't this caught by firewalls or other technologies?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. It depends on what exact firewall they would have or what sort of security device they would have. We work with a lot of different hospitals that have sort of standard security solutions, and they're great for finding things that are more IT focused, right? But as soon as you have a device that is involved with clinical functioning, its profile already looks a little bit different than you would expect a normal machine to look. And so it tends to flag false positives. It tends to not alert on things where it should be alerting. Whenever you have a device that is medical or that is medical adjacent, you really need a dedicated security solution in order to find these kind of things.
Yeah, and I'll add to that before we move to the next slide. At a higher level in terms of what's happening in the industry, a lot of healthcare environments have adopted traditional technologies proven in other areas, meaning they're securing against attacks of 5 or 10 years ago. And that was actually pretty beneficial up until the pandemic, when attackers kind of turned on healthcare. There was almost an honor amongst thieves there. They wouldn't attack healthcare because that's a bad, evil thing to do. Turns out bad, evil people like revenue more than they like being nice. And so as they focus on healthcare, they realize there's this whole set of not only vulnerabilities that are unaddressed, but devices like IoT and IoMT devices that are also unprotected that they could take advantage of. And that's why we've seen such a high spike, which is opportunity has presented itself and old protections don't protect new technologies. Mm-hmm. All right. I've said my piece. Asher, let's move to the next one. Let's talk a little bit about a stress test treadmill.
Absolutely. So the infamous WannaCry attacks that we've mentioned a couple of times before. We were working with a new customer. We had just arrived in their network. We had just started seeing traffic. And that same day, as soon as we were connected, we immediately noticed that something fishy was going on with a device that we eventually identified as a stress level treadmill. Basically, this is in this case, it was also a Windows machine, right? That was connected directly to a treadmill and did two things primarily. The first is it acquired readouts of, as you can see, from the illustrative photograph attached here, acquired various medical readouts, heart rate, and so on and so forth, and fed them back for further analysis to other systems. But it also actually controlled the treadmill, right? It controlled the test itself. As soon as we saw the traffic from this treadmill, we noticed that it had the telltale signs of a WannaCry infection. In this case, it was quite an aggressive version, although it is, even in the best case, it's a very aggressive ransomware worm, depending on whether it's being controlled or whether it's a sort of a remnant of a prior ransomware attack. But in any case, it's very, very dangerous. It tries to spread very, very quickly. In this case, it was attempting to infect basically the entire internal network, but it was also calling out to more or less the entire global IP space, trying to reach the internet. Whenever it managed to reach the internet, it would try to infect additional devices. So this hospital potentially could have infected more hospitals if there were other connections between them. We let them know within the hour that this device was extremely dangerous. And even if it didn't manage to infect other devices, it could crash the subnet, or it could crash portions of the network because of how much traffic it was generating, just obscene amounts. We'll let them know within the hour. It took them about an hour to get it offline completely. We told them to run forensics on it, told them, of course, to quarantine it and not allow it on the network. Actually, it's never returned to the network as far as we can tell. So I think they might have just decided to decommission it, or maybe just get rid of it. This could be one of those examples of the kind of things we were talking about with operating system upgrades, where sometimes it's such a hassle to upgrade the operating system that it actually makes more sense to just sell the device or disconnect it from the network, or some other solution rather than upgrade the operating system.
Yeah, and good points, and just a few other things to add to it. One of the really valuable parts of analyzing network traffic for these attacks is that the devices that are connected are very verbose, very talkative by nature, whether it be a stress test treadmill, IV pump we mentioned earlier. They're connected because it provides value to patients. It allows for better care. But it also means that they're talking a lot. So if an aggressive WannaCry attack, for example, gets in there, it's going to try to repeat. And if you're listening for the right things, you can detect that incredibly easily. They're not trying to mask that. They're not trying to evade detection at all, because they're just not being detected. So one is the nature of devices makes them susceptible to spread, but also susceptible to better protections. The other thing that Asher mentioned, as we see more and more mergers and acquisitions in healthcare right now, we are starting to see environments collide together. And there was a incredibly big cyber attack in the Midwest United States a couple of months ago, where systems had been brought together, and there was cross-pollination of attacks. I'm oversimplifying that attack, but as Asher mentioned, as this attack tried to reach out to others, if they're all in the same network, it becomes more susceptible to spread there. So think of these not just in terms of individual stress treadmills, but what else can it talk to and potentially affect? So, all right, Ash, let's move to the next one. I hit the wrong button on you. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about microbial detection units, which no one would even consider most of the time.
So this is a great example of the first point that you just made, which is this is a device that is surprisingly talkative. A lot of laboratory devices tend to be quite talkative because they're talking, they have a relatively little agency on their own. They're being controlled by some sort of laboratory management system or laboratory information system or something like that. And so they're constantly talking to their server. They're constantly saying, hey, I'm available for a test. I'm still running that test. I'm 90% through. I'm 91% through, and so on and so forth. And so if you're not, as you know, I like the frequency analogy that you used there. If you're not tuned to the right frequency, you would never notice that it was 20% more talkative than usual, and that extra 20% talking actually looked quite strange. So that's exactly the example that we have here. In this case, microbial detection device, primarily used, or actually only used in a laboratory environment, somehow got what we eventually found out was Quackbot malware on it. And the customer later reported that this was a result of phishing that had affected a number of other devices as well in the vicinity. But they had no indication that this was actually going on. We actually noticed it because the device tried to connect to a Syrian IP address or a number of Syrian IP addresses. Always sort of a red flag, right? Medical devices typically don't need that as part of their operational, standard operations. And that actually that indication was concurrent with the other sort of indication that I was talking about, which is that the device was more talkative than we would expect, and the additional traffic did look strange. Upon closer inspection, it was quite easy to notice that additional traffic didn't just look strange, it was completely different from what we were used to this microbial device in other environments. It looked completely different. And so we realized that this was basically another agent or another process going on within this device. We let the customer know quite quickly within the hour or two. This is another example of a device that just never returned to the network. It was taken offline. The customer ran forensics on it and decided to decommission it, basically because it was old enough and they didn't want to go through the hassle of having to replace it. But it was actively infected, meaning there's quite a lot of medical information, as you can imagine. I would expect there's quite a lot of medical information that goes on in lab tests, and they're almost exclusively tied to personally identifiable information. So it'll typically be the full name, date of birth, maybe even social security of a person, and then all of their lab results, some of which are quite sensitive and should remain private, and in any case are absolutely HIPAA violations to have a virus just listening in on that activity. Not to mention the fear that those lab results could be tampered with, which is not something that we typically see, with malwares. They're much more interested, as Chad mentioned, in extracting PHI and selling it. But just the thought that someone could have completely flipped all of the test results and the hospital would be none the wiser, right? Who double checks these kind of things if the device is not behaving strangely? Just that thought is quite worrying, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I do want to point out here, we believe the root cause here was phishing. Think about what the actual landscape of that network has to be. Someone on a laptop clicked on something they shouldn't have, and it got to a microbial detection unit. That was not a one-hop thing. That was some kind of
No.
spread there. There's a chain of events that has to happen there. So the reality is, I saw a great stat yesterday presented by Gary Kasparov, of all people, the chess grandmaster. Interesting session, but effectively what that session was doing besides pitching a product was releasing study results, and it said about 66, 67, 2/3 of all attacks come from some kind of human interaction, phishing or others. The reality is you're not always going to protect against those. You have to have a backup plan in place, and that's exactly what we do here.
Sure. I actually it's a great point. I'll go another minute on that if I can. A lot of the viruses that we tend to find are often on PCs that are supposed to be used exclusively for some sort of clinical function. In radiology, you have DICOM workstations. In laboratory environments, you have these kind of devices that are dedicated. The stress level treadmill is another great example of that. The human factor is almost always the weakest link in the security chain, and it's no exception in a healthcare environment. If you say this computer is only to be used for clinical activity, but that's not enforced in any meaningful way, that computer is going to get infected. There's no doubt, right? That's just how computers that are unprotected, that's just what happens to them.
Yeah, the great thing about computers is they do exactly what you tell them to. And if a virus, if malware gets access to it, it's going to do exactly what it tells it to, which is get infected and spread. All right, let's go ahead and click to this next one. Let's talk a little bit about cryptocurrency and healthcare, which should not exist as a
Absolutely.
sentence.
Nope. So in this instance, what we're talking about is actually a laptop that was brought in by a contractor, but it was brought into the hospital network, not a DMZ or anything like that. It was just interacting with other adjacent devices, some of which were used for clinical activity. And we picked up very quickly on the signs that crypto mining was going on. This is partially some internal traffic that looked strange, but mostly this was external traffic to known domains that are associated with crypto mining, and specifically with crypto mining malware. Now, part of the issue here is that crypto mining malware is rarely the main payload of the malware, right? It's typically a secondary payload. It's sort of a side gig, if you will, for the malware, right? The primary purpose of the malware is usually doing something more similar to what we were talking about before with streaming the desktop or getting files or infecting additional devices. This is just a symptom that happens to be easier to catch, and we caught this immediately. I believe if the device had remained connected for longer than an hour and a half, which is how long this incident lasted, we probably would have seen the other indications that are tied to the bigger, larger malware. But yeah, I mean, basically someone brought in a laptop that had already, bring your own infection from home kind of thing. It was introduced without being scanned beforehand, without any sort of antivirus or anything being run on it. We detected the traffic. We let them know. About an hour after we let them know, they kicked the laptop off the network, ran forensics on it, found a bunch of malware. They didn't specify which kind, but they said it was quite infected. And that they would not be allowing it back on the network anytime soon. In this instance, I think it's important to remember that you can have great endpoint security, for instance, on all of your devices. You can have tremendous firewall protection. You can look at security as a lobster, right? If my external shell is protected, then my internal network will be protected. It just doesn't work like that. You have too many externalities in the hospital setting, in a healthcare setting. People bringing in devices coming infected, devices coming online after they've been decommissioned for a while that already have a Trojan on them. These sort of things will inevitably happen in an organization that is as large as a hospital. And if you treat it as, if my perimeter is secure, then everything will be secure. That's just not going to cut it in this kind of environment.
Yeah, and this was a really interesting customer because they take great pride in the protections they've put in place, right? One of the reasons they brought us on a long time ago was because they are far, far ahead of the game, and they take a lot of pride in that. But it was a humbling experience because they realized they had all the technical protections in place, but they had a procedural loophole that allowed a device to get on the network. And if you're a contractor or ever have been, you're ready to start and you want to start at 9 a.m. that first day, and you don't want to wait around for the IT checks. It's exactly what happened here. Real life got in the way of best intentions, and this is what resulted. So we have to make sure to protect all those environments. Asher, let's go to the next one, EPHI.
Okay. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of none of this is made up. This is all real. I won't be mentioning product names, of course, but we are working with most of these vendors to try and close a lot of these that are considered vulnerabilities. Some of these are not vulnerabilities. Some of these are just what I mentioned earlier, configuration issues. There's not even a CVE associated. There's no specific sort of cyber risk associated. It's just open. These are the sort of things that attackers live for. They're easy. They require almost nothing from them. Once they've figured out that a specific system in one hospital behaves this way, they'll look for it in other hospitals, and if it works there, they'll just exfiltrate PHI and get on with their lives. This is how a lot of data breaches actually end up happening. So our first example is a picture archiving and communication system called PACS, sort of a central component of any radiology ecosystem in a hospital. It's communicating probably with most, if not all, of the radiological systems in the hospital. There's quite a common PACS that is installed in many, many, many different environments in the United States and globally. And the front door is secured, right? If you just access this IP, if you just put in this URL, you will get a login page with a username password. Great, that's what you'd expect to see. The issue is if you play around a little bit with that initial URL, and by a little bit, I really mean a little bit. This is the sort of things that attackers probably would even automate. This wouldn't even be a deliberate attempt by them. This would be some sort of fuzzing tool or something like that would find this. But basically, if you hit on this magic URL or some sort of variation on this magic URL, you're in, right? You're logged in as a super user, as an admin. You are in complete control of all of the personally identifiable information in there, all of the PHI in there, and there's a lot. This is probably one of the hubs of PHI in any hospital system. Contains both images and static data that is associated with patients. This is not good, right? And it's the sort of thing with how the URL is built. I'm trying not to get into too many details, but with how the URL and the magic URL is built, it's the sort of thing that a pen test just wouldn't find, right? This is pretty much only detectable by two groups of the population at large, right? Attackers who specialize in healthcare and cybersecurity solutions that specialize in healthcare. If you're not in one of those two groups, you probably would not be able to find this vulnerability. So that's the first one, the PACS. Do you want to mention anything about that, Chad?
No, I mean, PACS systems are known to be vulnerable. This is just an even easier way to get access to them. It's a great find. It's something that we found. The vendors have been very responsive. But as Asher mentioned, everyone has PACS systems. They're often globally accessible because the people reading the imaging might be literally half a world away due to budgetary reasons.
From your phone a lot of times.
Yeah, exactly. So the reality is there's a lot of patient data exposed through PACS, and anyone in a healthcare environment should be double and triple checking how that data is protected regardless of the system.
Yep. Second example, we'll talk about something that's a little bit more niche, right? A CVIS, so this is a cardiovascular information system. Again, this is a component that you basically have to have if you have any sort of a cardiovascular devices in your organization. Basically just consolidates all of the test results and all of the findings into one easily accessible location and controls which devices are currently testing which patients. In this case, again, this is going to be a common theme, right? The front door is secured. If you try to go there with HTTP or HTTPS, you get a login screen. However, a very, very quick port scan will show you that there are a number of unorthodox ports that are open on this specific CVIS. If you try to access one of those with HTTP, it's just open. You can just make a completely open patient query and see all of the various information that is relevant to each patient that has ever gone through this system. Chad mentioned that for PACS systems, they typically have to be globally accessible. CVIS and these sort of mid-level, mid-management kind of information systems, I think a lot of people would be surprised at how easily accessible these are as well. They often have external web pages that can be accessed from the internet. And in this particular case, we're also able to find, actually via Google search, another hospital network that was exposing their CVIS with this unorthodox port to the world at large, right? Obviously, whenever we see anything like that, we notify whoever's involved and help them remediate this exposure.
Yeah, one thing to add to that, Asher keeps saying the front door is secure, but one of the windows isn't. It's not a window on the top floor on the back side of the house. It is the window literally next to the door, which is cracked open with a pie sitting on it. In this case, I think I think the attack was to add a semicolon and 3 digits to a URL or something like that, right?
More or less.
Yeah, yeah. So it's 4 characters to get into this system, which is terrifying. Yep. So just to be clear, these are not complex attacks.
No, I think one of the ways that we look at this is, and this is based on obviously real world examples. Hackers, and I hope they won't mind that I'm disparaging them like this. Hackers are by and large pretty lazy, right? They want to get their money and they want to get out of there, and they don't want to have to use any fancier tools than they have to. And data is worth a lot of money, and if they can find one system in one hospital that is exposed in this way, they'll try it again every single time, and eventually they'll build up an arsenal of different EPHI exposures that they can use.
I'm going to call them efficient instead of lazy, just to try not to get in their bullseye. But
let's be politically correct.
They're evil, they're geniuses, they're efficient, and those are all kind of focused on healthcare right now.
Sure, the lazy was a compliment, but okay, I'm probably in hot water with them anyway at this point. Another great example of something that you wouldn't even necessarily consider to be a medical device or a medical information system. It's more of an organizational information system, or maybe IoT. Something like a smart whiteboard, right, which shows which beds are occupied or which patients are in transit from this department to that department or anything like that. Just another great example, the web interface here is secure and requires a login. However, doctors, nurses need to be able to see this from their phones. And when they do that, it's a slightly different interface. If you looked at this machine, if you looked at any traffic going through this machine for longer than 5 minutes, you would immediately notice that these mobiles use a different interface when they're accessing the smart whiteboard. And this interface does not require any credentials. Now, this is obviously a deficiency in the product. This is what we would definitely call a vulnerability, right? If you require a login for PC users, but not for mobile users. Obviously, there's no actual check that you're using a mobile device, right? If an attacker just brought a laptop, not even anything fancy, just literally brought a laptop, sat on the guest network of this particular hospital, and accessed this interface, they would be able to see all of the different full names, date of birth, social security numbers, also things that relate to which department people are going into, what sort of treatments they're going for. This is all protected health information. This is all no good for people to just be able to access a web page and see all of this, of course.
Yeah, and I don't know why it is, but this example gets a reaction from people. I went to a compliance conference a couple months ago, and I was using this specific example just because it's simple to understand. And I got 2 very specific responses by everyone I talked to. Either give me your card so we can talk more. Awesome, our sales team loved that. But the other reaction I got was great, which was I had people literally turn and walk away. Now, in my head, I would like to think they were calling their IT team and saying, we got to check our whiteboards. But whiteboards are everywhere. These digital whiteboards are everywhere. You can conceptually understand those. So if you're in IT, if you're in the security side of healthcare, and you're trying to figure out how to communicate how simple devices can introduce great risk. A smart whiteboard, for some reason, seems to work with C-level. So please steal that. Please feel free to use it.
So last example we'll be talking about is, again, something that I think a lot of people would associate more with the IoT world, right? This is a newborn RTLS, real-time location services system. You've probably seen them a lot if you've ever been in that area of a hospital, right? It's sort of wristbands or some sort of chip or tag or anything like that that is typically attached to the newborn, sometimes also to the mother, and it's basically just tracking the location and will alert if the baby has left the area that it's supposed to be in at the moment. Obviously, very important and very, very important to continued functioning if you want to be able to track where the babies are at any given moment in a hospital. And it's a great innovation, right? We're not trying to disparage the product in any way. In this particular instance, which is we've also seen this repeated in a number of other hospitals where we saw the same product. There's just direct telnet access. So this is the oldest and most basic way to interact on a sort of management or administrative level with a device, right? Just literally go into an old school port interface and tell the device what to do. So in this instance, you could directly edit the database of which wristbands are attached to which babies. You could delete the entire database if you wanted. You can reconfigure it with new information. You could actually slap a user password on there of your own devising, so you're the only one who could know at any given time where all these babies are, not release the information. I don't want to go into too many different scenarios. I think you could probably imagine that this is not ideal, and this is exactly the sort of nightmare scenario that some people consider to be science fiction. But if an attacker is already intending to ransomware a network and they find something just basically lying there like this, there's no reason they wouldn't use it to amplify their attack, to amplify the amount of damage that they're causing, and to amplify or not amplify, but increase the odds of getting paid, right? Chad, anything else on that?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to this before we move on is anyone, at least in the US, that works in healthcare for more than an hour or two has been trained on code pink. Effectively, code pink is called a newborn, someone under 12 months old, is missing, not where they're supposed to be. You lock down the entire hospital. No one goes past you. If someone is in a mental state where they would steal a newborn and they have the capability to change the data in our RTL system, these types of vulnerabilities make it possible. It's absolutely terrifying. It's a worst case scenario. The additional challenge here, a lot of these are not considered medical devices, so they don't fall under the guidelines, requirements, recommendations of the FDA and other groups. So it's really scary that we have these devices entering in without the proper checks in place. In worst case scenarios are really kind of nightmare movie scenarios.
Yeah.
Cool.
So these are just examples, right? I mean, every single environment we go into, we will find at least 4 or 5 of these kinds of things. Some of them are new, some of them we're already familiar with. Some of them, as I mentioned, we're working with vendors to try and solve. But these are just going to keep popping up unless you have some sort of way of monitoring, some sort of way of finding these. And as I mentioned, these are not typically these are not the things that a pen test or a standard security scan will find. These do require some understanding of clinical terminology, of how medical devices function, of how information systems function. And, we just gave examples of a high-level system, a sort of mid-level management system, a system that is typically associated with IoT, like a smart whiteboard, and something that is, to me, just terrifying, which is the newborn RTLS system.
Yeah. Outstanding findings, outstanding presentation, Asher. If anyone wants to learn more about these, please let us know. I'm going to wrap up here with a few more slides. But first of all, before I do, if you want to learn more specifically about the EPHI, one of our colleagues, Roe and myself, did a presentation back on Valentine's Day, incredibly romantic subject where we did talk about those EPHI findings, excuse me, in a little more detail. We also talked about the structure of information systems in hospitals that Asher spoke about a little bit. So if you do want to learn more, that is on our YouTube channel as well. I have a couple of questions coming in, a few things before we do there. First, what can we do? We don't want to give you all the bad stuff without some suggestions. The first thing we always recommend is erring towards action. We see a lot of people scared. We see a lot of people are prioritizing cybersecurity in healthcare, but they kind of stumble when it comes to taking action. And so the first thing I would say is reach out to your trusted advisors, reach out to us, reach out to consultants, reach out to those that you rely on to ask what you should put in place. And it's not going to be perfect, but you'll find you can often increase protections in some meaningful way rather quickly. Next is follow the leaders, see what others are doing. This comes from a Chime report that was released several months ago, the Digital Health Most Wired Survey 2022. And they documented what people are doing in cybersecurity, ranging from considering cybersecurity an essential priority over almost everything, down to investing up to 10% or more of your IT budget, right? Only a quarter of places do that. That's a big ask, but at least gives you a baseline to work with. So look in these studies, look in these surveys and see what others are reporting they're doing, because it gives you a very good roadmap and very good targets to aim for as you adopt new cybersecurity technologies. Closer to home with what Cynario offers, we do have an active detection offering that I'll talk about in just a second, as well as CMMS analysis. So your biomed teams, your healthcare technology management teams likely have a CMMS database in some way, whether it's just an Excel sheet with all the devices that they maintain, to a very, very rich system. What our team can do is actually analyze those devices really quickly. And I'll show you how we do that in a sec. And then finally, engage your partners, engage your MSPs, your managed service providers or managed security service providers. Ask them what they can do, because what we find quite often with the MSSPs in particular that we partner with is that for less or equal money, they can bring on greater expertise than you might have access to. They're not trying to replace the team you have in place. They're trying to make them more effective. So I highly recommend reaching out to them. To dive a little deeper here, active detection. This is a very straightforward engagement that we offer to any healthcare environment across the world. Effectively, we'll deploy our technology, deploy it rather quickly, go in, identify the most common types of risks that impact devices, identify any active attacks on your network. Hopefully we don't find any, and also potentially find exposed EPHI, kind of the systems that Asher was talking about earlier. We will wrap up that week or two with a Cynario live readout call. So we're not just going to say, here's a report, good luck. We'll get Asher, his team on and go through the findings in deep detail, and then figure out mutually how we work together to address those. We also have CMMS analysis. Like I said, you have a database of all your devices, or at least a subset of your devices. What we can do is get a very simple export. Sometimes it's just 2 or 3 columns, no sensitive data in there. Our team will analyze that over a couple of days. And again, about a week later, we'll schedule a readout call with you where we say, here's all your devices. Here are the risks. Here is the prioritized steps you should take. And this is a subset of what that looks like, where we talk about the types of risks, the heat maps, et cetera. And you can go ahead and reach out to me. We also have a website there with that QR code if you want to learn more about our CMMS analysis. There's a bunch of resources. I can pass along this deck to anyone that wants it. And Asher, I've got one question that came in. I will see if any more came in. I offer, anyone that wants to ask a question, go for it. What are the most common types of devices that we see attacked, right? We've heard Windows machines a lot today. We always pick on IV pumps. What else should people be on the lookout for?
So, I mean, it does depend on what you mean by attacks. I think the moment you use that term, a lot of people think of ransomware rather than a data breach. I think of an attack as encompassing all of those different kinds of possible outcomes. And so if you're asking what's the most common kind of device to be impacted by any sort of cyber attack, it's in my opinion, easily information systems like the PACS that I was mentioning, or the CVIS. And I know that's kind of a broad category, but it is something that is a lot less sort of marketable than an IV pump, right? Which is directly connected to a patient. And so obviously it's the first thing you think of when you think of potentially catastrophic cyber attacks. But these information systems that actually control the core functioning of the hospital, and they control the core information flow of the hospital, those are the ones that are A, most vulnerable, and B, most often attacked and most often targeted by at least the hackers or cyber attackers that are at least familiar with healthcare environments. If you want to, we have obviously statistics based on real life examples. of which devices are most likely to be impacted in the radiology department, or which are most likely to be impacted that are bedside devices like patient monitors versus IV pumps. We have all of those statistics, and they're fascinating conversations, but obviously, much longer than we have time for right now.
Cool. And I've got one more, and I'll take a first shot. You can add anything to it. The question is, why is patient data so valuable, and why do hackers focus on it? So I would say, first of all, hackers focus on two things right now: stealing patient data and executing ransomware attacks. The patient data is more valuable in some cases because it's static data. It can't be changed. So if we compare it to credit cards, right? If my credit card gets stolen, I cancel it. Maybe someone charges a little bit and I get refunded. My healthcare records include all my personal information, where I've lived in a lot of cases, my medical results, but it also may contain my family's information, my parents' names, my siblings' names, where they've lived, their medical results in some cases. And so you have this big group of data that is just static, that is easier to sell and easier to reuse for identity theft and other things. Estimates have it at about 25 to 50 times more valuable. It's kind of $3 to $5 versus a few $100s. The reason that people may focus on selling data over ransomware is because it's easier to sell data on the black market. If you execute a ransomware attack, you have to negotiate with the hospital, and that becomes a whole, literally a business. There are businesses out there that both execute on ransomware attacks, right? They're evil, they're bad. And there are insurance companies in particular that handle ransomware attacks and the negotiation around the ransom, things like that. Asher, anything to add to that?
I mean, that was great. I would just add a smaller point, which is that from a sort of cyber logistical perspective, if you will, ransomware is much more complicated. You need to achieve network superiority, or at least some form of network superiority, meaning you have to infect some sort of critical mass of devices. You have to, as Chad mentioned, negotiate. You have to receive payment in Bitcoin from the hospital or from an insurance company or something like that. It's a lot more complicated than someone finding their way into a network, seeing a large amount of PHI just on an open web page, downloading that information and getting out of Dodge, right? And just leaving the network and dealing afterwards with how to sell that information. So, if you put it in those terms, it's pretty clear that hackers would prefer to do this and not that.
Yep, great point. Asher, great job today. If anyone wants to talk more with Asher, more with our team about your specifics, let me know. I'll be happy to put you in touch. Everyone, thank you for the questions. Reach out to us with any questions that you have that come up after, and we look forward to talking to you. Have a great day, everyone.